Welcome. Lighting Essential Concepts is the current course, and we're taking a look at the baked lighting again, second part of it, this time about the light maps themselves. So what are light maps, how to generate them, how to alter them in 3D Studio Max, and a very brief word about volumetric light maps. Switching to the editor. I temporarily have the wrong level open, but I simply first want to, and you don't have to copy me here, I just simply want to show something first, and then we'll switch to the right level and start creating the content and go over the topics we need to. But first of all, what are light maps? Well, a light map is a texture that is automatically and internally within the engine and editor applied to a model. We're going to be working with this big model over here, which is part of the level you've seen in the previous chapter. And we're going to make sure this is light map. Now this is again the wrong level, so this one is already finished. But I'd just like to point out that if you go to settings, world settings, in Lightmass, in light maps you can actually see the light maps, and I want to show you what a light map looks like. This is the light map it makes. This is the texture the engine generates. Now Unreal does a couple of more complicated things than what a normal light map would be. A normal light map would only be the top section here. Unreal also does this strangely colored one. In fact, it makes two different versions of this one as well. But a light map is essentially an image that captures the color and the shadows and then just multiplies it on top. Here you see the shadows of the railing, and then this picture is simply blended on top of the model, and this is how we get lighting. So the lighting doesn't really exist anymore. We literally only see the picture that represents the lighting. But in order for the engine to be able to create this texture automatically, the model that it's going to create it for, that model needs to be prepared in the correct way. In other words, that model needs to have a light map UV coordinate ready to go for the engine to use. And that's what we're going to cover in this chapter. Let me switch to the right level. Lighting _ rendering, essential concepts, start assets, and we have a level called baked lighting _ light maps. So here's the level we will work in. It's the same setup, but this one simply doesn't have the lighting done yet. You can see the shadow clearly says preview. It also doesn't have very good detail here on the shadow of the railing. The model doesn't have, and we can't simply bake it by the way, because the model doesn't have any light map UV coordinates set up at all. We can know that if we right click the model and we do edit baked light map house 2, which is the model we have over here in the content browser by the way. If you do this, it opens up the static mesh editor, and then we have a button here called UV, and you can see here it's currently displaying non-UVs, so that's correct. I can set it to display UV channel 0, and that doesn't really look very good as you can see, so that doesn't help us either. What we expect to have here is a second UV channel. The second UV channel is the one used for lighting. That does not exist on this model, and therefore we can't bake. Now, how do we create a second light map UV channel? Well, the editor can do it for you. In fact, the default import options for importing models in the editor will automatically generate a second UV channel for you. So by default it's done automatically. In this case I've turned that off, so we can take a look at where that is in the settings over here. In the settings here we have lot 0, build settings, and in build settings we have the same options that we have as the import dialog when you import the model, and this says generate light map UVs, and I can say yes please, let's do that. And then you can set the minimum light map resolution, but you can change that later on, so just leave it be. You can say the source light map index 0, that's usually correct, so you'll just leave it be. And the destination light map index is 1. That's usually correct. You can see this is source index 0, so the current UVs, and then it's going to create index 1, which is essentially the second set of light map UV coordinates. Simply press apply changes. You can see that went very fast. If you look back in UVs now, you see you have two channels. And if you look at channel 1, we see this. This is what's now going to be used for the light map, generating the light maps by Lightmass. So now we would be ready to press build lighting, and it should look okay. The one thing we should set before we do that though is in general settings here you can see light map resolution is set to 4. It's 4 by 4 pixels in other words, and that's very small. So the sizes is kind of dependent on the model and what kind of project you work in. But in this case a value like 512 or 1024 is probably justified because we want to have very nice detail going on in the light map. So set it to something 512 or 1024, close this window, and you could bake it and it should look okay. But rather than doing this in the editor, because the generation of the editor is fairly okay, but sometimes for workflow reasons or for reasons you want to be able to really customize those lightmap UVs and perfect them, maybe you want to generate these in a 3D program instead. If you would want to do that, here's how you would do it. You can right click the model you have over here and export that, and then import it in a 3D modeling program of choice. This works in all major packages. It doesn't matter if you use Maya, 3D Studio Max, Modo, Blender, it's all the same. I'm going to use 3D Studio Max here. I have the model imported. I'm going to add an unwrap UVW. And I'm going to do this very quickly because this is not about how to use 3D Studio Max, so I'll skip a lot of the details here. But it's set to map channel 2 there, which means it's going to use a second channel. And I'm going to say Open UV Editor. And what we get here by default looks like this. Then usually I switch it to polygon mode. I go to Tools, Flatten Mapping. You have some options. I'll just leave the options be at what it is. OK. And we get something more or less similar to what Unreal generated. And then I would do this for every single model I have in the project, export those models, import them back in Unreal, and this would also result in Lightmap coordinates to be available. Now, the way both Unreal and 3D Studio Max or any other 3D program does it is not ideal. There is a lot to be desired for. For example, you can see here, this is angled. That shouldn't be. Straight is much better than angled, so it shouldn't have been angled. It should be able to just place it straight. There's a lot of empty spaces between the UV islands as well. Ideally that shouldn't have happened, but this is such a tedious work and such a manual labor that in 95% of the times you're simply going to let either the 3D program or Unreal generate it and you'll just go with it. Okay. It's only in rare cases where I would manually tweak the UV layout here to really perfect it. When there are particular problems or I really want the absolute highest quality on that model, I would manually change it. Otherwise, I just leave it be. When you're going to create these kind of UV layouts, one thing to take into account rule-wise is there should be absolutely no overlapping between any set of UV coordinates. So this would have been wrong. There can be absolutely no overlapping at all. There can be no flipping. So you wouldn't be able to, for example, do this, mirror it. That would be wrong. And it cannot exceed the UV 0 to 1 space. UV 0, UV 1. So it has to stay within the square. This is therefore wrong. In fact, preferably it's not even on the edge. This is also already, I wouldn't do this. Have a little bit of buffer zone between the edges. As long as you stick to those rules, this is all you have to do. And you can see here, after the bake is done, it looks like this. Now, lastly, I want to bring up a brief word about volumetric light maps. And I don't want to really explain it because it's going to be quite difficult to explain this in a few minutes. I just want to point out that it exists. If you go to Show, Visualize, Volumetric light map, and you enable that, you get this. A volumetric light map is a second type of light map that is generated by Lightmass as well. So it's generated by the same process of doing this. And it places itself in a grid over the entire world. The density of that grid will change dependent on the Lightmass importance volume and the proximity to any models. You can see near the models, there's a higher density than in empty space over here. This is meant for storing light information for dynamic models that will pass through the world after the lighting has been built. Because if you would, for example, have a small bird or something like that, there's a bird flying around and the bird would land over here in the shadow. How would that bird know that it has to color itself with this amount of color and this tint of lighting? How would that bird know what the light information is at this location? Because the light has been baked into textures. So that dynamic model, that bird wouldn't be able to sample those textures in the same way these models can, and instead they would fall back on volumetric light maps. So they would sample the nearest volumetric light map and receive the light information from that one in order to shade itself with the right tint and color. So again, it happens automatically. I just want to point out that it's happening for general understanding of how the engine works and how dynamic models differ from statically lit models with a light map. So we've gone through what light maps are, how to generate them, how to author them in 3D Studio Max, and a very brief word about volumetric light maps and the fact that they exist and how they are important for dynamic models passing through an already baked statically lit environment.